Have you ever wondered what happens when a grand, world-shaping theory is put under the microscope of rigorous systematic logic? Well, today, in this explainer, we are exploring a really fascinating theoretical critique of Marxism. And to make this whole thing come alive, we're going to follow a dynamic debate directly from our source text. It's between two characters, Mark, who is our highly analytical critic, and Stan, this skeptical defender. So let's just dive right in. Our explainer begins with Stan throwing out a simple, direct question. He asks, "Why do you have such a problem with Marxism?" And Mark replies with his totally calm, methodical energy. He tells Stan that, dialectically speaking, truth isn't found in fragments, but in totality. Things aren't static, they are processes in constant motion. So to criticize Marxism properly, he has to systematically break it down from the ground up. He tells Stan to listen carefully and just jump in with objections as they go. Stan agrees, and the debate is on. So let's get into section 1, the economic reductionism critique. Marx starts with his first major premise, which is that every single revolutionary theory needs a framework to diagnose exactly what is wrong with the current system. But Marx argues that when you apply this lens to Marx's framework, you immediately hit a wall of severe economic reductionism. To really understand this, we have to look at how Marx defines the core problem of society, which is economic exploitation. This is essentially defined as the extraction of surplus value by the bourgeois, the owners, from the labor of the proletariat, the workers. Marx argues that Marx takes the vast, incredibly messy complexity of human suffering and squeezes it almost entirely into this one single economic relationship. Which brings us to section 2, domination beyond economics. Marx doesn't just stop at the factory floor. He pivots to point out a massive blind spot in the theory, arguing that domination exists far, far outside the boundaries of just economic exploitation. Power isn't only about who owns the means of production. Marx lists off everyday realities that completely defy purely economic explanations. Think about it. Two people in the exact same socioeconomic class can still exist in a racial hierarchy where one completely dominates the other. They can dominate one another through sex or gender. Religious majorities suppress minorities all the time. Ethnic groups dominate other ethnic groups. Older generations dominate younger ones. A teacher holds power over students without exploiting them for profit. A man might commit domestic violence against his wife without any economic motive whatsoever. Economic exploitation is absolutely real, but it's just one slice of the pie. To really drive this point home, Marx brings up a specific, deeply chilling anecdote: the Sialkot lynching from December 2021. In this tragedy, a working-class cleric issued a blasphemy accusation and successfully mobilized a violent mob against someone who was actually wealthier than himself. Just pause and think about that for a second. The person with less economic power completely dominated and literally destroyed the person with more economic power. It proves Marx's point perfectly. Power can be mobilized through religion, status, and social hierarchy without any economic ownership being involved at all. A purely economic analysis is simply way too narrow to capture that reality. Now, Stan isn't just going to take this sitting down. He pushes back defensively, saying, "Hold on a second. Marx didn't only talk about exploitation. He discussed alienation, commodity fetishism, and a whole lot of other things too." And Stan asks, what about later thinkers like Pierre Bourdieu, who expanded the theory to include concepts like cultural capital and symbolic capital? But Marx fires right back, pointing out that Stan is actually falling into a massive language trap. Yes, Marx talked about alienation, but that alienation emerges directly from economic exploitation. Commodity fetishism emerges from capitalist production, and even when theorists like Bourdieu try to expand the idea, Marx says, just look at the word they use, cultural capital. Marx argues that the terminology itself is totally trapped. It still interprets all human power dynamics through a lens of accumulation that is modeled entirely after economics. So economic exploitation remains the foundational base, while everything else is just treated as a secondary superstructure. Let's move on to section 3, the Vanguard Party paradox. Let's look at how this builds into real-world application. Marx transitions to the practical reality of classical Marxism, and how it hits this incredible paradox where it inherently reproduces the exact same hierarchies it claims to abolish. He guides Stan through the traditional pipeline. It starts with study circles. Then, those expand into a vanguard party. This party educates, organizes, and waits for revolutionary conditions. Now, because the masses are considered insufficiently educated to govern directly, the vanguard party steps in to assume leadership. And finally, after the revolution, you reach what Lenin openly called a state capitalism monopoly. The state essentially nationalizes all production, and the party centrally plans everything. And here is the crucial, really tragic part of the story. At this state capitalism stage, power does not actually go to the workers. Instead, it concentrates into a brand new, incredibly formidable elite. We're talking bureaucrats, central planners, military institutions, and party leadership. Marx references Engels' writings and later revolutionary practice to show that enemies must be crushed with an iron hand. First the bourgeoisie, sure, and then ideological adversaries. But the crushing doesn't stop there. Even potential rivals like independent unions, cooperatives, or decentralized worker associations have to be eliminated. Basically, anything that distributes power outside the centralized party suddenly becomes a mortal threat. All right, Section 4, the permanent transition problem. Stan is pretty quiet at this point as Marx explores the next theoretical stage. In Marxist theory, this highly militarized state capitalism is eventually supposed to transition into socialism, and then kind of magically wither away into stateless communism. But Marx breaks down a massive logical flaw here. The theory states that the centralized state can only disappear once external capitalist threats disappear. That means the revolution must either spread globally and simultaneously everywhere, or the state must remain permanently militarized to defend itself. And because the real world is messy and never transforms uniformly, those external threats never actually vanish. Therefore, the transition never ends. The temporary dictatorship just becomes permanent. Stan, holding on to a bit of hope, asks a hypothetical. He says, well, suppose the state actually disappeared. What if we actually achieved the goal and worker cooperatives took over the economy? And Marx sharply replies, what guarantees that worker cooperatives wouldn't behave exactly like capitalist firms? Marx's analytical breakdown is just relentless here. He argues that even if you have 50 worker owners, they wouldn't necessarily prioritize the environment or social welfare over their own profit. They would still be competing in a market. Stronger cooperatives would inevitably start dominating the weaker ones, new hierarchies would emerge all over again. Marx concludes that in this sense, socialism risks merely becoming the multiplication of owners rather than the actual abolition of domination. You haven't ended the power struggle at all, you have just changed who gets to play the game. And then there is the ultimate endgame, stateless communism, where money disappears and humans labor purely for fulfillment. Marx points out that believing in this requires just an extraordinary level of naivete. You have to genuinely believe that a ruling vanguard party, one that currently possesses absolute, unchecked control over the military, the institutions, and all resources, would simply voluntarily abolish its own privileges and step down from power. History, and frankly human nature, heavily suggest otherwise. Now for Section 5, evolving toward anarchism. Stan absorbs all of this critique, but he throws up one final defense. He says, Marxism has evolved. And, he's right. Stan brings up modern defenses, citing contemporary thinkers. He mentions Richard Wolff advocating for worker cooperatives, John Holloway speaking of finding cracks within capitalism, Eric Olin Wright proposing interstitial transformation, or eco-socialists critiquing industrial productivism. When you look at it, it really does seem like a vibrant, evolving theory. But Marx counters by saying, sure, it evolved, but let's actually look at what that evolution represents. He makes a really sharp observation. Many contemporary Marxists have quietly abandoned the core orthodox assumptions of Marx. Almost all of these modern positions, the cooperatives, the decentralized councils, the prefigurative politics, they actually move much closer to anarchist decentralization. They are entirely stripping away the centralized vanguard and the strict economic reductionism, but they are retaining the Marxist vocabulary. So as Marx sees it, it is essentially anarchism wearing a Marxist disguise. Which leads to Marx's final, incredibly provocative question for Stan. He asks, if you have abandoned the central premises of Marxist orthodoxy, the economic reductionism, the vanguard party, the centralized state, and you've become more aligned with anarchist decentralization, why continue calling it Marxism? And Stan, he is just speechless for a second. He stares at the ground, processing the systematic dismantling of his entire framework. Finally, completely defeated, he says, I know that you are wrong, but I would have to consult with our leadership. It is such a brilliant, ironic punchline, but it perfectly proves Marx's entire point. Even in defending the theory, Stan's immediate instinct is to defer to a centralized authority. It leaves us with a really powerful question about how deeply entrenched hierarchies truly are in human systems, regardless of the utopian labels we slap on them. So, what do you think happens when revolutionary ideals meet the messy reality of human power? Keep asking those questions and keep exploring.